The world is evolving at a faster pace than ever before, and as we begin the path to recovery after global disruption, this podcast explores how the design industries can adapt to changing expectations and create a better future for people, business, and the planet. I'm Lisa White, Creative Director at WGSN. You're listening to Create Tomorrow, the WGSN podcast. With the global sense of disappointment felt after COP26, it's even more crucial to discuss and determine how brands and creatives can design systems and products that respond to the climate emergency. This is why we are here today with Carole Collet, who recently presented at our Trend Futures seminar. Carole is Professor in Design for Sustainable Futures at Central St. Martin's University in London, where she currently holds two key roles. She is Director of Maison Zero, the Central St. Martin's LVMH platform for regenerative luxury set up in 2017. She is also co-director of the Living Systems Lab, a research lab which explores the inherent properties of biological living systems to develop new knowledge in the field of ecology via creative practices in art, design, and architecture. She's also currently developing a new online MA in regenerative design for 2022. In her research, Collet questions how and what we can learn from living systems to develop inherently sustainable and regenerative design propositions. She curated the first international biodesign exhibition, Alive, New Design Frontiers, in 2013. I was there, it was fabulous, to propose a sustainable framework for biodesign. Her design work has been featured in international exhibitions such as the V&A, the Pompidou Center, and the International Design Biennial in Saint-Étienne. She regularly contributes to conferences on the subjects of living systems and applications in design, biomimicry, and regenerative futures. Carole, welcome. It is wonderful to have you with us again.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's get into the questions, into the nitty-gritty here. In the presentation that you shared with WGSN in September, one of your key points is that sustainability has to work for all, for nature, for humans, but also for business. Can you please explain that further?
Yes, I think the point I was trying to make is that as designers, we design for humans. So it's by humans for humans. But more and more, we have a much better understanding of our planet, how it works, and our impact on the planet. And particularly when it comes to biodiversity, we now know that we have about 1 million species at risk of extinction. We're endangering every ecosystems in every part of the planet. Every continent has been impacted. And that's simply due to our lifestyle, our manufacturing systems, our consumption systems. So we need to really start looking at how else we can inhabit this planet by thinking about other species. So this notion of multi-species thinking is becoming more and more prominent in the design industries. So yes, of course, we still design for human and for human consumptions, but can we design our products, whatever products we're designing, in such a way that they benefit other species too? And this is what's becoming really exciting as a creative opportunity for us, is to move into that space of regenerative design. So we go beyond sustainability, beyond reducing impact, whether it's reducing our water consumption, our toxicity, whether it's decreasing our carbon emission, our energy use. We're moving into this space where we would like to look at how we can design as an act of care. How can we design so that other species can be replenished simply by the choices we make at the design stage? So by choosing material that come from regenerative agriculture, for instance, we then ensure that the materials have been grown and generated in a way that helps replenishing our soils, replenishing our ecosystems. And simply making that choice at the design stage is promoting a much more flourishing ecosystem restoration. So I think that's what's really exciting for us now, is that we're beginning to understand that not only we've impacted on every part of the planet, but there are new ways to look at making in a way that we can restore what we have damaged. And we know it can be done. We have the science, we have the facts. really all it takes is up to us designers to start to shift our mindset and to think about how we can benefit a range of species, not just humans.
And that's an excellent point. And you were speaking as well too about how we can think about sustainability and how it benefits business as well. And can you expand upon that a little bit?
So, this can happen at many levels. So, a lot of brands have really focused on sustainability in the past 30 years, and a lot of it actually makes business sense. If you're looking at, for instance, switching all your lighting systems to LEDs, which consume a lot less energy, then that's a radical move in reducing your energy consumption. That straight away translates into cost saving in terms of bills. So there's a real business case here in terms of reducing our impact. However, we know that sustainability now is really not enough because, yes, we can decrease and reduce our water usage or electricity usage. But at the same time, if we look at the past 70 years, our human population has tripled in 70 years. So whilst we've been busy, some brands have been very busy reducing their impact, our world population and demands for products and consumption has tripled. So where brands are at now, which is becoming interesting, is that, reducing is great and it makes sense business-wise. But the other aspect that makes sense business-wise is to think more in terms of long-term. So, for instance, if a brand is dependent upon a particular natural resource which is grown, in agricultural model, conventional agricultural model are currently threatening our own species because they don't draw carbon anymore. We need to halve our carbon emissions. We have 98 months left by 2030 to reduce our carbon emission by half across the world, across every sector. So, brands need to start and are beginning to start thinking that if they are relying on agricultural model, for instance, which are degenerative, then there's no long-term future for that brand because there's a bit of a boomerang effect. It will kind of, impact on the brand later on down the line. But there's also now an increasingly better informed consumer. Consumers want to know what brands are doing. They want more transparency and they want to know that they are not leading to, more toxicity in our soil, more water pollution, more air pollution. And so looking after your consumer makes business sense because if you lose your consumer, you lose your business. So I think what's interesting now is that beyond reducing impact, brands are starting to think a bit more long term and thinking about, okay, well, I need to invest in this. And if we do this and we stop deforestation because we didn't realize, but these materials lead to deforestation, then that will pay back through, consumer understanding that we're doing our best and our bits, but also ensuring the future resilience of our supply chain will only happen if we invest in supply chain that are inherently more sustainable. So I think a lot of brands are moving away from this notion of decreasing impact or reducing impact to looking at ensuring long-term viability of sustainable practice, which really takes the form of rewilding, reforestation, regenerative systems.
Let's talk about words, because one of the most important words you use is provocation. We've been using the word disruption for many years, and it refers to a disturbance, particularly in an industry, such as radical disruption brought about by technology, for example. But the word provocation is actually both stronger and sexier. It's about actively inciting a reaction or an action. So why do you think this word is so important to use in conjunction with sustainability today?
I think that's a really interesting question. We talk a lot about disruptive technologies, for instance, but if I think of me as a designer, if someone's doing something that disrupts my way of doing or way of thinking, I could be left slightly puzzled. I could be left in a way that I feel like, but so what now? What's going on? And I think what's important is that designers feel empowered. And when you provoke a designer, I mean, if someone provokes me, all I want to do is respond with an outstanding response. So provocation can lead to quite a positive response and reactions, and you can use the typical what if provocation, what if you were only doing this, or what if you were looking at this. So I think it's got a very positive, empowering kind of message. Whereas disruptive, yes, it's disruptive, but you don't always know what to make with that disruption. With a provocation, I think it's an invitation to respond.
And it's really something that, every designer, every corporation can take on board. How are we going to provoke change?
Yeah, and, I think also too often I think we think of design or any design briefs as let's do this, let's do that. But I think if a design brief starts with a question, it's fundamentally straight away much more innovative, because as opposed to have an end product in mind, an end process in mind, you've got an open question, and then the design process becomes an inquiry into that knowledge, into that way of making. And therefore, you're more open to possibilities you may not consider if you're just saying, I want to design a shoe, or if the question is, how can I design a system that helps and promotes better ergonomic experience for a human. Or so you kind of really start to think about asking questions is perhaps more pertinent than framing a brief in terms of here's a product I want to design. But what if you provoke that end product and ask a question about what could you do about this?
One thing that I think is interesting too, that was part of our discussion when you were presenting at WGSN, is we were talking about the word sustainability, and you'd said that the word sustainability itself has become very greenwashed, as we saw at COP26. So much so that word sustainability is losing its power. What are the words that you think we should be using, and how will they bring us forward?
Yeah, this is challenging, because sustainability, as defined in the original Brundtland report, is really defining an activity that is sustainable, does not jeopardize the future of our future generations. So originally, I think the definition of sustainability was really fit for purpose. However, the way it's been adopted was very much in anything from someone doing something that can be recycled, to someone making a product from recycled, to someone decreasing their CO2 emission by switching to an alternative material. So it's become this very vague term used by anybody and anyone doing a tiny little bit to a lot of work. So it's really difficult now, because what does it mean to be sustainable? It's too broad a term. And I think the narrative that is, again, empowering, and I think we need to talk about empowerment, in particular after what happened at COP, is this notion of regenerative design, because it says it in what it is. It's the idea of regenerating what we've damaged and destroyed in the past 50 years. And having run workshops in the past few months on regenerative design, regenerative fashion, it's incredible how that switch in narrative is really empowering. And I can see designers responding to this because they want to be part of repairing the world, as opposed to be part of doing sustainable design, which is doing less bad. And I think just shifting that narrative, and I know some of the last workshops I ran were very powerful in that, where some designers didn't feel really excited by sustainability. But when you talk about, but can you go beyond sustainability? Can you start to repair climate and biodiversity through your very act of creativity? It's really a radical transformation, and it's very empowering, and it's a very positive message. People want to be part of that repair, that restoration. And I think that's really where we need to really move, but without falling into another greenwashing trick. I'm already seeing a lot of people using the term regenerative when actually what they mean is sort of broad sustainability. It doesn't actually mean it's repairing or regenerating carbon or climate or biodiversity. So I think we need to be very precise with our word so that we don't lose the power of that new narrative.
To be really clear for people who are listening right now, can you give an example of regenerative design that you've used in your workshops to explain to people exactly what that is?
So I'll use an example of one of my favorite designer, Fernando Lapos, who's a Mexican designer who grew up in Mexico, studied at Central St. Martin's in the UK, so could see kind of different world operating, but then went back to Mexico after his studies and went to a particular region and a village where he used to spend his summers as a child. And what was then a thriving community and village had fallen into complete, an impoverished state. No more corn was grown there. The soil was eroded. High levels of unemployment. People moving out of the village, simply because of they switched from native corn growing to the sort of more mainstream corn for the American market. And that had I don't have time now to explain, but it had a rippled effect and cascading effect, which led to a sort of degenerative system for the entire community. And what he did was simply reinvesting in the land, replanting native corn, which will be replanting agave. So he's been working on this for nearly 10 years now, and he's restoring biodiversity. And the byproduct of the corn, which is the leaf that you collect from the husk, are used and transformed and made into surface treatment for interior design. And so basically the product he creates is the consequence of regenerating land and biodiversity. And currently the way most of us design is we think of natural resources as a means to design a product. But in regenerative design, the product is the end result of a regenerative process. In this case is regenerating the soil. When soil is rich, it will capture more carbon, so it's good for climate. And when you replant a whole set of ecosystems, and he's looking at agave planting to also capture water, we can see more species coming back, more biodiversity starting to replenish, because when you have an insect coming back, then the bird comes back. So there's a cascading effect in restoring the land. But in this case, it's restoring the land and using the leftover of that corn to make a product which was innovative, hadn't been done, hadn't been seen. It's everywhere. It's in museums now. It's sold by the meter. And he's employing women from the village who were not employed before. So it's also got a social benefit, not just a biodiversity benefit. So that's very much a holistic approach. So it's benefiting the soil, the climate, the biodiversity, and people. So it's this kind of embedded sort of deep connection between all the stakeholders in that particular location that actually have been restored through purely the invention of this new material, which is, again, this leaf that is sort of designed in a surface material. So that's really the idea of, the product is the end result of a regenerative process.
Exactly. It's super comprehensive. And we've been talking about this at WGSN as a long-term trend for years. It's a focus on systems, not stuff.
Yeah.
And really making sure you get your systems right.
But it's not easy. And it really requires to think about the whole system, how everything is interconnected, who benefits, who doesn't benefit. The time span, the legacy, you can't rewild and regenerate land in 2 months. It will take years before to get back to what it was 20, 30 years ago. But it's that mindset of thinking about what do you start with, what do you add, how do you create a product, and how do you create benefits? I mean, it is a profit-driven, it's a very good business model, what he's done. It works for him, but for, local villagers who now are employed when they would never have had any employment on site.
And as you said earlier as well, too, you were talking about biodiversity, which has been so much in the news lately. And one of my favorite projects currently is Dr. Alexander Daisy Ginsberg's Pollinator Pathmaker project, which, in short, designs gardens from the point of view of pollinators. And so she asks, if a bee were to design a garden, what would humans see? And Carole, where do you think the focus on multi-species thinking is going on designing from the point of view of animals and even plants? Where do you think that's going to take us?
I think it's really exciting, and I love this project. I think it's very timely, it's very pertinent, but it's also very easy to understand. What if a bee designed a garden? And it goes back to what we discussed earlier, where instead of thinking I'm going to design a garden, you ask a question: what if a bee designed a garden? And that straight away leads to radical, disruptive way of thinking about how we design a garden. And I think there's more and more designers excited by this multi-species thinking, because it's opening up a whole new different ways of designing. In terms of creativity, it's really exciting. Instead of just designing for humans, now you can design for every species and incorporate their behavior, their need, and their parameters for survival in how we design. So it's exponentially augmenting our potential as designers. So it's actually, for me, making it really exciting. And I think what is beyond this, any designer, and in the case of, Daisy Ginsburg is very pro biodiversity. She would understand all of this very well. But if a designer was to do this without really knowing, they'd have to first understand how bees work, how they see, because they don't see the same way we do. And therefore, so there's quite a lot of research to do, which, a more conventional garden designers wouldn't have necessarily done. They might have designed a few, bee hotels. That's where we've been for a long time, designing so that we help our insects. But going as far as designing for bee really drives this notion of empathy. When you understand how a bee would design a garden or see a garden, suddenly you think through the lens of someone else or from another species. And that really, really drives empathy. And we need more of that.
And appreciation for the inherent intelligence and knowledge of animals. And, to take it a step further, I'd like to ask you, what is plant intelligence? How can we think of plants as being intelligent?
Well, so we've just talked about bee, and, we as humans, we tend to think of we're on the top of the chain, and you have animals, then you have maybe insects. But when you think of intelligence, we should really shift to understanding we're not on top of any systems. We're part of a planetary ecosystems. And we don't understand well the animal world, although it is changing. I've read recently that now octopuses and crabs and lobsters have been recognized as sentient beings. It's about time. But when it comes to plant, it's even worse. We take the plant world for granted. We don't assume that, quite often you could think, you look at a plant landscape and people say, well, there's nobody here. Well, actually, there's loads of bodies there, and they're plant bodies. And when we talk about plant intelligence, it's a controversial term in the scientific community because it's not intelligence in a way we talk about it in a human sense. But plants are full of sensors. Plants can sense through their roots, through their leaves, they have a lot of hair through their stems or their leaves. They can send chemical signals. They can receive signals. They can communicate. So, for instance, a plant could be attacked by, maybe a deer is eating it. They will send a signal that will signal to her sister plants that there's a danger. And then some plants can then respond by changing their chemical structure so that their leaves become bitter, so that animal will stop eating it. So there's a lot of plant communication going on at all levels, under the soil and above soil. Some argue that plant can hear now. There's some research going in that direction. Some plants, this is a paper I read, Canadian scientists look at particular type of grass where that grass could recognize its own daughters or sons, whatever we call them, and not compete with them through the roots, but compete with other. So they knew their lineage. They knew which plants to compete with and which not to. So we are learning a huge amount on plant, and this whole notion of plant thinking and how we discover the capacity and potential of plant to communicate, change, move, and actually respond to danger is really striking. And for me, I'm passionate about it. I think it's really exciting new territory. And it shows, I think it also helps understand that, the planet is made of all these different types of species, from, bacteria to fungi to plant systems to animals, and they all have a role to play, and they all do it in different ways. But I wouldn't say that one is less important than the other. The soil, the richness of our soil would not exist without the very rich microorganism ecosystems which we depend upon. And so I think we need to start to open our mind to the fact that we're not on the top of a chain. We are part of an ecosystem of very, very tiny organisms to much larger ones, and they all have a role to play. And then we need to listen more to other species and learn from them in how they correspond, how they sustain healthy, balanced ecosystems through their everyday behavior and actions. And plants do that too.
Yeah, there's so many things that, for lack of a better word, they know that we have forgotten in some ways in the way that they behave. And one of the things I find so interesting too is that plants care for one another. And bamboo is one of the best examples where when you have a thicket of bamboo, you end up with, the older bamboo really nourishing the younger bamboo shoots. And then when their shoots get older, the oldest ones actually retire and they don't have to produce as much energy. And the younger ones take over and help the older ones through retirement. So there's this whole community happening in bamboo that we can't see with the naked eye. But it teaches us a lot about how we should care for one another.
And it's all about controlling nutrient exchange and making sure it's a fair share. And this is not, as humans, we're not very good at fair share. And we've seen that again at COP, where, we're supposed to try and get at least 100 billion support in funding to emerging economies. And that's not happening. And I think this notion of fair share is happening in all ecosystems. Even if you look at, if you have in savannah, a lion killing a zebra, but they're not going to kill all the zebras just to eat one. There is this fair balance of, ecosystems and this fair use of other natural systems. And I think humans, we are some of the only ones not being very fair in our, even with each other, within our own species. We're extremely unfair, let alone with other species.
Another very interesting point that you brought out from a sociological, ecological, and industrial perspective was the importance of care versus competition. I loved that part of your presentation, because the Western world has been largely based on the idea that competition drives innovation. But you pointed out that care is where the focus should lie. And can you explain a little bit further?
I think that also comes from the notion of living system thinking, where if you think in system, you can't just have one part of the system out-competing and outperforming the other. It's always about this balance. So, you could be a designer, you could be a brand, really, really good, having expertise in a field, and you could simply compete with other people having that same expertise. But actually, that doesn't help the system. What helps the system is when you look at who complements your expertise to reach your success criteria, or to do even better. And then when you look at complementarity, then that will lead to more care, because it's not about competing for the sake of competing. It's about how can we join forces to create something that is much more value driven. And I can see that changing as well. I mean, some brands now have chief purpose officers, where it's looking at the purpose and the value-driven mission of the company as opposed to the profit-driven mission. Of course, brands have to generate profits, but I think they can see that both for their staff and for their customers, the purpose of the company is important. And so for that, competition doesn't work. It's got to be more this notion of how do we care for our communities, whether by communities we mean our suppliers, whether we mean our consumers, our various stakeholders. But I think it's back to this system thinking. If we were to collaborate, to care together, as opposed to compete with each other, we would progress faster in that notion of value-driven economic success.
And how do you think that brands can encourage different points of view that drive innovation in their businesses? Just some simple ways of driving innovation, even in the way they organize their businesses.
Where do we start? I think one of the first thing I would say is that brands need to allocate time to think differently. And I see particularly in the design sector, so many brands, so many design teams are constantly on emergency drive, over-delivering, in overshoot mode all the time, which means it's depleting their bandwidth, their creative capacity, but also it's not leaving any time to take a risk, to try something different, and to maybe that's not going to work because something else would work better. So I think for me the key to shifting from this profit-driven to more value-driven but still successful business model is to allocate some time for miniature R&D sessions. And what I mean by that, it could be a 2 hours workshop to really rethink what are the questions we're asking when we're making this product. And that might simply be enough to leverage a new departure, a new way to think about how we make that product, all the way to creating powerful sabbatical for their staff. So send them for training, send them for a conference, send them to spend a week in the forest and do forest bathing and have developed their empathy for plant system and plant thinking. But basically, I think for me, what will facilitate this transition, which we need urgently, is this notion of R&D. But not necessarily, it doesn't mean you have to go and build a whole new R&D center. It could be these micro R&D sessions, which can be in a 2 hours workshop. You can leverage quite radical ways of thinking differently. And that could be very impactful down the line. So carving time, but time that pays back in many ways, whether it's the well-being of the staff or whether it pays back because the end product is better developed, better thought through, and that's better for the consumer and for the planet.
I remember you had pointed out as well, too, that even in, breaking down silos and making sure that people who normally don't work together end up working together and creating new points of view. So, marketing, might be next to sourcing, or, you're pointing out that even from an HR perspective, you could almost put different offices next to one another, or get different people involved maybe in these R&D sessions that they normally would not have met in a large company.
But even to organize this sort of, shadow day. So if you get someone from the CSR team to shadow a designer for a day, you'll see throughout the day how many questions that designer has to do with the sustainable impact of that material they want to work with, and how many times they would need help. And that might help that CSR person to think, we need better guidelines for this. But equally, you could get a designer to shadow someone who's sourcing so that they understand how difficult it is to source better fabrics. I'm talking about a fashion brand here. But I think these micro interventions, whether it's workshops or whether it's shadowing someone, understanding someone else's perspectives, it's back to Daisy Ginsburg, designing a garden from a bee perspective. Well, if you design a collection, it's not just the designers involved in a collection. You've got a production team, you've got the marketing team, the sourcing team. So what if you look at the collection from the marketing lens, from the sourcing lens, from the design lens or the production lens, you see it differently. So just to facilitate this exchange of perspective is usually very enriching on a personal level, but it pays back because there's again more empathy towards the different performance indicators that each team have to deliver. It's like understanding why someone has to do this. But that could also highlight potential clash, potential contradictions. When a designer tells me, yes, we want to use organic cotton, but our production team tells me, no, it's too expensive. That wouldn't happen with system thinking, because yes, it might be a bit more expensive, but you might decrease costs somewhere else, which evens out this increase. And so when you think in silos, it leads to degenerative economic systems, I have to say. I think to drive towards that regenerative system, we need to think in system and have all the teams cooperating together.
To round things out here at the end of the podcast, I wanted to ask you just two more questions that are rather quick ones, but important. Since we are rapidly heading into the new year, to 2022, what is the number one thing every business, every brand, every designer should do for 2022?
Move into regenerative processes, design, and really use creativity to do that. I think for designers, it's one of the most exciting time in our history. We have now a huge number of new technologies, new materials emerging, and we have all the science. The facts are there, the science is there. So now it's up to us to really, as creatives, as designers, make this happen. So I think for me, the focus should be go beyond sustainability, move into that space where whatever you do helps repair the climate and biodiversity and social communities. So I think for me, that's a shift. And we have 98 months left to beat the 2030 deadline that the IPCC tells us in terms of staying below the 1.5 degrees. It's in months now. So we need, and by moving into anything to do with regenerative, that means we repair the climate, we repair biodiversity, and that's where we need to be.
And with that short timeline and that imperative, as you say, we are really going to be seeing the business value of creativity coming to the fore. But to finish up, one last question. For 2022 and in the 98 months ahead, what are you most hopeful and excited about?
I think I'm, in a way, because COP was for me a failure, COP highlighted once again that we cannot wait for our government leaders to take the actions we need to take. But at the same time, it's made the space for us to get on with it. And I think what's exciting for me is that it's up to us as creatives to really take the lead and to show governments that actually we can do it. Because they don't have the confidence, they don't have the trust and the belief that it can be done. But actually, we can drive a radical new way of making and thinking about how we make and manufacture stuff. So I think for me, what's exciting is that we have an open horizon to reinvent ourselves. And that's an incredible place to be for designers.
Thank you so much, Carole Collet, for taking time to speak to us today. If you're a WGSN subscriber, you'll find reports covering many of the issues we touched upon on our Insight and Interiors platforms. And for a glimpse into multi-species thinking, do check out our Future Drivers and Future Innovation reports, as well as our Create Better white paper. If you want to find out how to subscribe, head over to WGSN.com to discover how you can get access to our service. We're constantly publishing new content focusing on how we can design a brighter, better future for our industries, including food and drink, interiors, beauty, fashion, and consumer tech. You can subscribe to the show on all major podcast platforms, and if you like what you've heard, why not leave us a rating and a review on iTunes? I'd also like to thank our podcast producer, Roland Bodnam. We'll be back in 2 weeks for our next episode when Beth and Ryder will be diving into all things festive with experts from WGSN Insight, fashion, and food and drink. Thank you very much.